Welcome to Writers in Conversation. This is a series of talks by writers who come to Southampton and interviewed, usually by the person on my left, Carol Burns. But tonight, the role has changed and she has become our interviewee. Carol is the author of a new book of short stories, The Missing Woman and Other Stories, which is on sale at the stall over there. It's my role, I'm Peter Middleton by the way, to interview Carol. I'll do what I can, but I realise that I'm up against an expert. So, the short story, I think, is a genre that in the UK has been something of a second-class citizen in the world of literature. The short story has often seemed to be somewhat neglected in academic studies, and I think it's fair to say that it's not been the primary area that people work in. I remember Ramesh Gunasekara, who was a writer in residence here, had published a book of short stories as his first book, which was very well received. And I asked him about it, and he said, "Yeah, terrible mistake. I didn't realise we were supposed to write novels." But in fact, the short story deserves attention in its own right. It's a wonderful form. Some of the finest modern writers in the English language have been short story writers. So Catherine Mansfield, for example, is I think one of our finest writers, and perhaps sometimes slightly pushed aside because she's a short story writer. Doris Lessing, who people normally think of as a novelist, actually is again one of our great short story writers. It's a genre I very much love. It's subtle, it's verbally rich, it's capable of hinting at entire lifetimes, and yet concentrated sometimes into a single extended instant of time. I think that the short story has always been much better recognised in America. We might want to talk about that in a minute. And it's, I thought, a very good sign that Alice Munro was awarded the Nobel Prize for literature, a writer who has only ever written short stories. Carol, I think, is a very fine short story writer indeed. She writes stories about characters about whom it would be hard to be neutral. I think for me, one of the striking features of her stories is that you get really invested in the characters. You think, she can't be right, or I really hope things turn out for her, or why is he behaving in this way? What's the matter with him? You become very invested in them. I think sometimes they're stories that almost might be narratives that you present to an analyst, stories that draw you into intense questioning of behaviour, motives, and the choices made by the characters. So there's a story called Other Women, and there's a character called May, and she's having an affair with her best friend's husband, and we become really fascinated but exasperated with her as well. Why is she doing this? Why is she behaving this way? In another story, The City of Brotherly Something, a quite wonderful title, I think. The City of Brotherly Something. Do you know where that is? Anybody know? Philadelphia, yeah. The City of Brotherly Something, the missing noun, hidden by that evasive word something, points readers to the theme of whether certain actions and choices are signs of love. The character Tree, or Teresa, her inability to decide whether she loves her ex-lover David and whether he still loves her, points us to the mystery of her father's remarriage. Is it for love or companionship or out of grief or for some other reason? And it makes us readers think hard about all these characters and their doings. It seems to me, Carol, you really like to present dilemmas to readers and invite them to reflect on what's happening and why. Could you perhaps just reflect on this aspect of the fictions you write? And I know that you're keen to read us a story as well.
I remember Peter was on my interview panel when I was hired here, and he said some things like that about my story, and I said, "Oh, can you just keep talking? I don't want to answer that question. I just want to have Peter keep talking about my stories." Anyways, thank you, Peter. That was a lovely introduction. I don't exactly know how to answer this question. I just think, I suppose there are situations that interest me, and hopefully the characters, they come out of the characters as opposed to just like some sort of plot twist. And when I think about writers who are influential to what I wanted to do, even though I don't necessarily want to write sentences like Henry James, the way he traces a woman's, especially consciousness, is something I was really interested in. It's something I suppose I aspire to. And if, in a way, if that's coming through with, in the way you spoke about it, it seems like that's coming through a bit in terms of their consciousness and their dilemmas and their choices.
So I know that you've been thinking of reading The Missing Woman, and that seems to me a story rich in these dilemmas. Could you perhaps introduce it to us?
No, I'm just going to read it.
Okay.
Jill felt the baby breathing sleep into her arms as she watched the mechanic hoist her bicycle onto a lift. The gears were noisy, shifting before she did. The mechanic turned her wheels to listen. Quick, click, click, clicks like a stream over rocks. Heard the gears shift, shifted them himself. He reached behind him without looking to grasp a wrench with his right hand, tossed it lightly to his left as if it were a girl on his arm, then stepped forward to stop the spinning wheel with the palm of his hand. All of it, Jill, the bike, baby Trina, the shop, suspended by his gentle motion. Hey, what's wrong with it? Her husband strode into the shop holding their daughter April's hand. She was silent as she walked, thumb in her mouth, still not fully awake after falling asleep in the car. He had on his Saturday voice, the voice Jill hoped to hear when she woke in the morning, cheery, friendly, open to the day. His job as a prosecutor had been snapped shut in his briefcase or maybe tossed in the shed where Michael kept his tools. Jill didn't care where, as long as he disappeared. Just needs a little adjustment, said the mechanic, maybe also the shop owner. He was thin, tall and thin with grainy blonde hair, so sandy it was nearly gray, no sheen at all. He had that proprietary air about him, comfortable among the bikes and the tools he seemed to find by feel. It was Michael who'd wanted Bill's bike tweaked on their way to Georgetown to ride the canal trail. Though she was anxious to get on the trail, she had indulged him. She liked the idea of stopping in DuPont Circle for a quick tune-up the way they used to on weekend mornings before the girls were born, with just themselves and their bikes and maybe a bottle of water. It's an old bike, Jill said apologetically. Though its body still gleamed blue, its silver gears were mottled black, in places even rusty. Michael had been after her for years to get a new one. It's a beaut, the man said. Parts all made of metal, not plastic. Bikes are lighter these days, but cheaper too. She raised her eyebrow at Michael, gave him a little, ha. He swung April's hand into one of his, then the other. His body was thick and softly muscular, almost plush. He was barely taller than Jill. Their gazes were completely even. You think you've won now, don't you? He said lightly, the southern accent that reemerged sporadically when he was sleepy, when he was home in Atlanta, coming through. You hitting the trails? The mechanic pulled the chains loose from the gears. In his hand, the metal links looked elastic. We're going to drive down to Georgetown, take off from there. She described the route, taking the Capitol Crescent Trail until it intersected with the canal, following the dirt towpath as long as they dared with the girls in tow. Michael used to prefer the paved efficiency of the Capitol Crescent, had liked getting lunch at one of the restaurants where it ended in downtown Bethesda. Now he had decided the canal trail was wider, flatter, less crowded, and therefore safer for the kids. Jill took this small gift gladly. She liked looking left to the river, right towards the canal, as if she were floating between two bodies of water. I have a favorite spot, she said, shifting Trina carefully to her other shoulder. The baby squirmed but didn't wake. Near Lock 7. I go there in the mornings when Michael can watch the kids, when I'm able to rouse myself out of bed early enough. I've seen black-crowned night herons there, green herons, and of course blues. Michael pulled April to his leg, cupped his hand on the side of her head and stood straight and alert. "I know that spot," the mechanic said. "It's near Little Falls." "That's right. Do you go?" "I've always wanted to get there at dawn. Haven't made it yet." They chattered on about routes, favorite mini trails that went down to the river, where Jill would get off her bike, walk through the trees and brush, and to sit and watch the water. As the bike guy went in back to get a part, Jill grazed her cheek on Trina's baby hair, her warm head. She closed her eyes and remembered the last time she'd been able to get out at dawn before Michael went to work, the feeling of weightlessness as she took off on her own, of danger even, as she slipped through Michael's overprotective worry. It was probably 2 months ago now. It had been only the second or third warm day of spring. She gazed around the shop and found Michael staring at her with snap black eyes. "You shouldn't spill your life out to strangers," he said. She stood still, held Trina, tried not to wake her. She whispered fiercely, "Michael!" Freaking giving him your minute-by-minute itinerary? He lifted April to his hip, but she wriggled down. He kept hold of her hand as she tried to escape to run around the shop. "You just shouldn't. Everyone uses those trails. He's not an axe murderer." The mechanic returned as Trina was beginning to fuss herself awake. Jill wrapped her arms around her and swayed in place. The world, she thought, wasn't a crime scene. But she kept quiet. Maybe she had been talking too much, because the bike mechanic didn't speak either. He stepped to the front of the bike, spun the wheel, lifted the chain off, reached back for a tool, listening, concentrating only on his work. Jill knew from his fluid movements that he'd be a good dancer. His touch was light yet attentive, his lead just that, a lead, not a push. So light you felt you were leading, the same way he let the bike lead while guiding it, just the same. He was probably gay, a thin dancing bike mechanic in DuPont Circle, so Jill let herself imagine dancing with him, his hand on her waist, his movements graceful. She could almost feel him guiding her as she held her baby daughter close, her husband, dark, stocky, by her side. So the next section is Michael's. And they leave the bike shop, they go down and set up all the various equipment they have for this, what used to be a simple bike trip. So, Michael will be, they start off at the end of this scene. Michael's in front. Is that right? I can't remember. Michael's towing both girls and Jill's in back. And so he likes that because then everyone's in sight. And anyways, the only thing you really need to know from this section is Jill has a nickname for all these things that they do, and they call this entire like car and bike seat and everything, she calls it the Royal Entourage. Now they're on the bike trail. Ahead, 2 women wearing pants and jean jackets, as if it were cold out, were halting people on the trail. A younger woman, long black hair slipping forward in greeting, held out a friendly hand when she approached people. The other, older, with silvery blonde hair, stood back. They stuck out as incongruous. Political petition, Jill thought, here on the trail? Some people whizzed by on their bikes without slowing down. Even from a distance it looked rude, and Jill resolved at least to stop and hear what they wanted. "I'm sorry to bother you." The younger woman, carrying flyers, smiled in apology. Her face was pale as winter. "We're looking for a friend. She's been missing since Tuesday." "Since Tuesday?" Jill counted the days as she and Michael stood astride their bikes. She'd been missing for 5 days. The woman's sing-song voice nearly lulled the menace right out of what she was saying. Was her friend even alive? Why hadn't they read about this in the paper? The woman continued. "We think she might have been here on the trail." "Why do you think she was here?" Michael asked, sharp. "Her car was found in the neighborhood back there." She motioned behind her, right near the trail. "We think maybe she'd parked and taken a walk, but..." She hesitated for the first time. "We don't really know." The friend handed them a flyer with the woman's photo. She'd been caught by surprise, a smile just beginning to appear, blonde hair loose around her face. She looked pretty in a casual sort of way. "So were you here on the trail Tuesday morning?" the first woman asked. "Have you seen anything?" "No," Michael answered for them. "We mainly come on weekends. Jill used to come in the mornings." He made it sound like past tense. Was she a jogger? Did she take morning walks? Mommy! Mommy! April started chanting from her trailer. Honey, shush. Not really. The woman's voice sounded matter of fact, a forced, practiced calm as if she'd been doing this her whole life. Jill wondered when it would hit them, how many separate times it would hit them that their friend was missing. Mommy! 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 Faster and louder. Michael was in prosecutor mode, gentle with his soft accent but firm. Where exactly was her car? Were her keys in it? Did she know anyone in the area? Do you think she could have gotten the ride-on bus to the metro? Jill used to like this Michael. He used to make her feel safe, like he'd get all the information they needed. Today, she just wished he'd back down. The woman on the flyer stared back at Jill, her eyebrow raised as if in a challenge. She looked bemused, as if all of this, as if life, was slightly funny. Jill tried to figure out if she'd seen her on the trail on the few days she was able to get out on her own. Would she remember her? She might be more likely to recall someone's golden retriever, a limpy jog, before her face or hair. Did she take walks in the morning? Michael asked. Were you sure she was here on the trail? Listen. The second woman, shorter, stepped forward and spoke for the first time. She was wiry, intensely athletic, someone who, restless as dawn, might go hiking the trail. Listen, I'm her sister, and I don't even know, so thanks for stopping. No one said anything as the sister stood, hand on her hip, ready to move on. It was as if the missing woman herself had shown up to plead her case. Jill looked at the photo for a resemblance and recognized the woman's demanding gaze. Good luck, Jill said as she found her voice. I wish we'd seen her, that we'd been here. Michael turned to grab his handlebars, but Jill remained still. Ahead, on the trail, she saw that strong vines growing from the canal had already tentacled onto the dirt towpath. The woods across the canal, the swampy undergrowth between the trail and the river, the trail itself, all seemed vast and impenetrable. How would they ever find her? Then the river and the canal, which should have made the search seem easier, limiting the land to a thin strip, themselves became menacing, as if they could swallow up all of them, let alone one woman missing for 5 days. Yeah, good luck, Michael added. Can we help? Jill asked. Popped out of her mouth as she thought of how quick the growth would get as the summer went on. Did the sister know? By July, it would feel like a jungle. Mommy! 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 She could sense Michael stiffen, though he released his handlebars, smiled pleasantly. I mean, can we help you look for her? Jill asked. Do you have enough people looking? The women hesitated. The young one glanced at Trina and April. Sure, but... The sister finished. You've got a full boat today. Michael stuck out his hand, wished them luck again, and ended the conversation without seeming as if he'd cut anything short, though Jill knew he had. He had cut her short from volunteering the whole family, from turning their bike ride into a search for a woman they didn't know. She thought about saying something as the women walked away, but didn't. You really shouldn't be biking this alone, he said, his foot on his pedal. April was quiet as she sensed they were setting off again. You don't even know she was on the trail, Jill said. He took off. She looked back at the women halting 2 walkers, answering questions, although they didn't have much information to share, didn't know why their friend and sister was missing, what she'd been doing, where she'd been. Was she a jogger? I'm sorry. Good luck. Jill got on her bike and caught up to Michael, Trina, April, the royal entourage. She didn't look back again to see. Michael felt himself riding faster than normal. He slowed down, then began thinking again of the woman, missing for 5 days already. She didn't stand a chance, and knew his legs were pumping faster again. April's cart rattled loudly over a small pothole. Would Jill really have stopped to help? Did she realize this is what he did every day? Help people determine what happened to husbands, brothers, sisters who were killed, abused? Did she? I forgot to mention that Michael is a prosecutor in Washington, D.C., so I should have mentioned that. Yesterday, he had watched the faces of the grand juror listen in their objective juror masks to the testimony of a 5-year-old boy, his kid voice lilting high and summary in that dark chamber meant for adults, describing what the man had done to him when his mother wasn't home. naming parts of a body a boy shouldn't know the names of, describing acts a boy shouldn't have even imagined yet. One juror held his hand over his eyes as if the boy's words were a light too harsh for the man to bear, so he hid his eyes because he couldn't block his ears. It was a victory for Michael. The grand jury was so convinced they'd upped the charge to the more serious offense he had argued for, that he'd been told to back off from by his boss. A good day at the office. He'd watched the faces of the jurors, not used to what he had heard 1,000 times already, from this boy, from others. Maybe that's what scared him, knowing too much, being inured to it, not trusting himself to be careful enough, so he was too careful. He found Jill in his rearview mirror. She was nearly anonymous under her bike helmet and sunglasses, but still feminine, with her slim arms, her tight breasts a little larger since she was still nursing. He wished there was a way to make her look more like a man when she was out here riding by herself. Her long hair, already back in a ponytail, could be pinned up. She could wear a looser shirt. Because she looked so female despite her slim, tomboy frame. He'd buy her an iPhone for Christmas, though she didn't want one, didn't want any more gadgets. It's disgusting how many gadgets Americans buy that they don't need, she'd say. No, not for Christmas. He'd just upgrade to the next version and give her his iPhone. Justify it that way. Turn on that app that lets you locate the phone when it's lost. He'd always be able to find her. Michael, wait. Jill braked, skidding on the sand. He stopped gently and turned toward her without getting off his bike. What was the problem? Trina gurgled behind him as if the mere sight of his face gave her joy. Michael, I want to help them. Can't we help them? He heard himself sigh. He tried to sound patient, reasonable. Jill, we've got 2 kids here, sweetie. We're already behind schedule. The girls are going to be hungry pretty soon. His reason sounded stupid and selfish. He felt stupid and selfish, but he didn't want to stop. He didn't think it was a responsible thing to do. Besides, the search was pointless, a necessary gesture, but largely pointless. He tried to say the next part gently. Honey, their friend, her sister, probably isn't alive. It's been 5 days. Was he the only one who realized this? How can we not help them? We're not doing anything. He wondered what the woman's friends thought they were accomplishing. He could see they weren't doing a good job. They should be bunched together, shoulder to shoulder, meticulously searching each square inch for clues, an earring, a button, instead of spreading out into groups of 2 or 3 as if they'd been scattered by the wind. They would need another 50 people to make a difference. 2 more people, Jill, aren't going to help. She was being impractical. She always was impractical, charmingly impractical, but she couldn't do that anymore, and he was getting angry. She couldn't have her bike breaking down when they had 2 kids to get home. They couldn't drop their plans and join a search party with the girls in tow, could they? She had to be more sensible. At the least, the kids would get hungry, tired, let alone upset if, God forbid, they found something. Jill would get upset. They would sense the atmosphere. Hell, he didn't want to be the one beating back the thick brush off the trail to discover underneath the lush green fern a woman's dead body. Honey, what if we find something? Do you want April seeing that? Living with that? Jill? Jill felt bombarded by Michael's logic, as if each fact was a little stone he was tossing at her bike helmet. He was right, but he wasn't right. How could they not stop? We used to help, she said. She threw that at him, that maybe just a few years ago they would have stopped and helped. Jill would have. On her own, she would have done it without thinking. She used to carry Michael along on these impulses of hers. He'd join her as if they were doing something crazy, bungee jumping, parachuting. He'd step up with a sense of adventure. We didn't have any kids, hon. We have more than ourselves to worry about now. Jill thought about the girls and their hunger and felt her right breast, the one Trina preferred, suddenly full, brimming. It spilled wet into the cup of her nursing bra, but she'd just eaten. Trina should be fine. She'll be fine, Jill said. They'll be... A biker raced toward them. He whizzed by in a flash of yellow nylon, black helmet, tanned arms, legs pedaling so fast they were almost spiraling. and then he was gone. She smelled his sweat, subtle and strange. She didn't know what to make of them. The men like machines on their bikes, the women walking, the couples jogging with their happy dogs, all of them oblivious to the missing woman and Jill and her daughters who were bound to be hungry or tired or frightened. "Oh, Michael," she said. She heard his kickstand clink against a rock and his sneakers on the dirt as he walked toward her. Her bike was still under her as he hugged her, almost tipping them. "It's frightening, isn't it?" He kissed her forehead like he would one of the kids. "It's horrible." She wanted to believe it, that she was crying over a woman she didn't know. "You come here by yourself? It's frightening." She felt her tears wetting his shirt. "Do you want to go look for her?" "We can look for her. The kids won't know. I'm sorry." She glanced up at him and saw that he meant it. She knew he didn't want to stop and search, even now. Most people wouldn't think of stopping. Most women with 2 children and a husband they didn't see enough anymore wouldn't even consider bringing 2 children when those kids were just about ready to eat on a search party. The idea itself was an extravagance. Jill felt herself relent. "No, it's okay. The kids," she said. "You sure?" he asked. She could hear the relief in his voice, but he said it kindly. He meant it. April howled. The sound was dulled by the nylon cover of her wagon, but still loud. Jill ran over to her. It didn't sound like a hurt scream, and peered inside. A scared scream? April's face was already red, as if she'd been crying for hours, not seconds, her cheeks completely wet. "Honey, come here. What is it, sweetie?" April crawled out of the wagon to be held, soothed. Michael patted her head as Jill held her. They walked over to Trina, a preemptive strike. She looked worried, or maybe just curious. Jill was still amazed that one didn't always set off the other. April quieted in her arms. "What was that?" Michael asked, tempting fate. He couldn't assume her crying fit was over. "Maybe tired? Hungry?" Jill asked her daughter, but April couldn't say. She wasn't old enough yet to put words to whatever was making her cry. Jill wondered if anyone was. They gave both their girls apple juice and graham crackers and prepared to set off again. "I wonder if she just wanted to be moving," she said. They laughed at the idea, their imperious toddler demanding the royal entourage get rolling again. Ahead of her, April and Trina seemed content. Their heads turned one way, then another, as joggers and rollerbladers and bicyclists sped at them and past them. She could see the red shadow of April inside her wagon, her back completely straight. Ever since she could sit up, April had held herself erect, like a dancer. On the river, a crew team rounded markers for a practice run. A pair of kayaks, one yellow, one red, glided downstream. In rhythm, their paddles flashed in the sun. Michael's bell ching-chinged as he passed a pair of walkers. A muscle twitched under his nylon shirt. He held his back straight, barely turning to look at the river or the canal, interested only in going forward. As she followed him, she wondered for a moment if he still loved her. As he pedaled swiftly on, relieved to be going again, relieved her fit of willfulness was over, she felt this piece of him resisting her, steel-like, unyielding. Of course he loved her. She knew he did, but she didn't know it the way she used to, in a wave of knowing that stayed within her, never left but kept gently insisting as if she'd always known. Now she knew with her head. Of course he loved her, first with her head, before she could feel it in her heart. She also knew she'd regret not stopping, all day and all night and all weekend, and years later, if she thought of it, she'd regret not stopping to help search for the missing woman. She wondered if her regret over not stopping would make her stop the next time. And she knew it wouldn't, and her regret turned inward as she wondered what was missing, why she wouldn't be able to stop, why the kids and Michael and the fear of not being able to keep her family whole made her unable to follow her instinct to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. That was wonderful. What I particularly noticed in that story, as in a number of others, is that you're very interested in those moments when that we shift from the heart to the head, or the embodied self to some more abstracted idea of who we are. There are several moments in that story. I was struck by another story where you have a character who's kissing or thinking about kissing on a first date, and she says, "It's a little like landing in a foreign country," which is, I thought, a wonderful sort of comparison. But you're very interested in these moments of visceral, intimate embarrassment, or moments when the self, the embodied self, intrudes on consciousness. I wonder if you could say a bit more about this. It seemed a very, very powerful part of your writing to me.
I suppose to me it's a reflection of inner conflict with the character, where often you have an instinct to do something, or you want to do something, and then your head stops you. And I also think that there's often we can just feel things instinctually in a way that our head can rationalize them away. And with the title of The Missing Woman, I mean, The Missing Woman wasn't the first story I wrote, and it wasn't either the title of the collection. It was one of the later stories I wrote. And when I wrote it, obviously the title of that story would be The Missing Woman. And I thought, oh, this is a perfect title for the collection, because the women are either literally missing, like this woman who's disappeared from a bike trail, or a mother who's in rehab, or they're metaphorically missing some piece of themselves. So, and that has to do with the conflict of something they're not listening to in themselves, I think. I do have a funny story that when I was in Washington, D.C., and was having a...
Sorry.
It's okay. And explained to somebody this idea. I at the time hadn't used the word metaphorical. I said that, you know, as a woman are literally missing or missing a piece of themselves. And the man said, like an arm? So I always use the word metaphorically now and there.
Now, you mentioned Washington. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about your background and how you came into writing. You worked as a journalist, didn't you, at one time? Do you think working in journalism has led you into writing, or helped you in your writing in any way?
Oh, I think it was a stop along the path. I mean, I always wanted to write, but I didn't have the moxie to just go and do it. And I also knew I needed some kind of way of earning money. And so when I was an undergraduate, like a lot of my students, I had an English degree. I studied English, but I took the creative writing class module here and there. And, you know, and I loved those. But I knew I had to get a job, so I volunteered for the student newspaper. And then I sort of fell in love with journalism itself, and that was after my BA. That's what I did for 6 years full time. But there's a moment when my partner at the time was, you know, the New York Times, as you guys probably know, on Sunday is about that big, and there's about 80 sections. And he was pulling all the news sections, and I was pulling the book review section. And I thought, wait a minute, this is what I want to be doing. And so then I started taking graduate classes, and then I enrolled in the MFA program at Columbia.
I see. Because I always think of journalism as a great training in several aspects of fiction writing that are vital. Above all, being a good observer, being able to notice what's happening and then find words for it. But also sort of thinking through, if you like, the evidence for the story. What kind of journalism are you doing, if I might ask?
Oh, I was very much in those early years a local news reporter, working for, you know, medium-sized newspapers in Connecticut, which is where I grew up. And at one point we joked I had the 4-H beat. It was health, humanities, human services, and holiness. We covered religion. And then I covered education. And then after I went to graduate school, I started freelancing for the New York Times, and I was covering sort of statewide Connecticut issues. So I was very much a news reporter, but also loved writing feature stories. And so that was probably a way of being a little bit creative.
Yeah, I feel in the story that you read to us that I can see the journalist somewhere in the background in the portrait of the prosecutor. There's something that one of the characters says, and I'm going to forget which. It's a long division, I think. But there's a character who, as I read the story, is sort of obsessively worries over the lost moments of a life. You know, that nothing must be lost, everything must be remembered and recorded and sort of almost relivable. And I wondered, it just intrigued me as just an insight, because your story is ambivalent about that, but that must be something else that you've thought about as a writer.
Well, I suppose the story I just read has a lost moment of what would have happened if Jill could have sent Michael on with the kids, really, and stopped herself. I mean, there's a lost moment there, and that's she talks about it, that it will haunt her in some way.
Yes, that's sort of powerful. I think in a moment I'll ask our audience for questions. I guess I've got sort of, if I may, just ask one more. Actually, I want to ask you a couple of questions. Actually, one was just in the story that God who was himself whispered in her ear. You have a portrait of a storyteller. A professional storyteller, and I highly recommend this story. It sort of folds in on itself, so there's a story within a story, almost within a story. But have you ever done that? Have you ever been tempted to be a storyteller?
No, I'm really not at all like that. The way, but I have a friend who is a storyteller, and in fact, I stole his story. That is my friend, telling his story. The rest, of course, isn't true. But and he was fine with that, because storytellers feel that's what stories are there. You use it in the way that you want to use it, and they make a story their own. And so I definitely adopted that story that he told.
Yes, so the story is recirculating, as it were. It feels like a folk tale sort of rubbed down by retelling and retelling.
Yeah.
But I think it was your mention of what I was going to ask you before I recalled that was something about your endings. Short stories are notoriously tricky to end, I think. Closure in a short story. I mean, how do you finish it? Sure, the story gets going, but notoriously writers find that stories get away from them, and what was supposed to be a short story becomes a novella or even a novel. I particularly like the way you end the story, My Life in Dog Years, which is a great title in itself. But could you tell us something about how you think about endings in stories?
I think they sort of find themselves. I'm not really sure that I can plan it. I don't write in order. My early drafts, even on a novel, is I write in longhand, usually, completely out of order. I often don't even know I'm working on a story yet. And so, and when I have enough in my longhand notebook to sort of allow myself to put it on the computer, that's when I begin to shape it and order it and sort of figure out what it's about. And so whether that ending is in that notebook or it comes later, I think really depends on the story. I'm trying to think if there's any story where I knew the ending when I started, and I don't think so. You had mentioned that My Life in Dog Years seemed to end very sort of naturally in a surprise. I think it was a surprise to me.
Well, reading the story, you have a sense of astonishment almost that you share with the protagonist. She's done this seemingly crazy thing of bringing a dead dog home from the vet where she works, and at some point she wakes up to the fact that she's now going to confront her family, and they totally surprise her. Yes,
and again, this wasn't a student today asked me how you go about putting symbols in your story, and I said, you can't really try to do a symbol because then it ends up feeling like a cymbal, you know, like the kind that you crash together. But anyways, what I liked about that ending is while it's about, ostensibly about the dog, she's worrying throughout this whole story about whether her family will support her trying to become a veterinarian. And while the story doesn't say that, and I don't even know for sure if they do, the point is that they're behind her and they get her, and that seems almost more important.
Yeah, and you don't. It's a wonderful example of showing and not telling. As a reader, you think, oh goodness, they do care for her, despite her doubts and concerns. I guess the other ending that really quite stunned me was the ending of a story called Changing Colour, about a very painful experience of losing a child to a cot death. And it just ends with the protagonist out sitting in the garden looking at these tulips, which have been a sort of motif in the story, and she just says, "These are the things I wanted to teach you. Tulips, grass, red, yellow, the sun sets, the moon is full, I am here." And that struck me as a wonderful ending, and again, totally unexpected.
Thank you. That story started as a personal essay about growing tulips. And at some point I was I created for myself a little writing residency in Provincetown, Massachusetts, which, if any of you know, is at the very, very tip of Cape Cod. And I was working on my thesis for my MFA, which is like a dissertation. In fact, the MFA was 150 pages, the dissertation, so it was really more like a PhD. And anyway, so I'd taken myself off for 3 weeks in Provincetown in January, and there was an open mic, and I looked at this little essay, and I thought about writing, and I thought, no, this isn't any good, but I thought there's something here that I should save. So I took the tulip part of the essay and then created this story out of it. But I think the ending came as part of the story. That wasn't part of the essay.
Right, that feels very integral. It feels like the only resolution that it feels the right resolution, and it brings in the reader and the absent child and the tulips, and we don't know which is which. Well, I'm sure there are questions that you're wanting to ask Carol, so let's open this out to the audience then. Do I have any questions for Carol?
And I'm just going to ask whether you feel that when you're writing about America or revisiting your stories about America, whether things all seem slightly different now, or whether it's a slightly odder experience than it might have been, and maybe even a more creative experience.
Yeah, it's interesting that the story that is God, who was himself whispered in her ear, is the only story that's set in the UK. And there's one other there's one little flash fiction sort of set in London, but really it could be anywhere. And then there's the story about the mathematician that's set in France, and they're both English. But otherwise, all my stories are set in America, as is the novel that's gone around to publishers right now, as in the novel I started this summer. So it's odd. I know Margot Livesey is a Scottish writer who lives in America, and she said it was a big deal for her when a segment of her novel was set in America. Like, her work is still set here. So it's interesting. I think, though, that the current novel, at least, I think I see America with a bit more distance. That's extremely useful. The only thing I worry about is, do I still know what it's like to live in America? Because part of the novel's set about 25 years ago, and part of it's set in the Obama era. And I've never lived in America in the Obama era. So, but it does feel like that's still what I want to write about.
Do you think you might write a Welsh novel one day?
I don't know. I'm pretty happy I've written a Welsh story.
Yeah.
I'm going to just leave it at that for now.
It's got rugby.
It does have rugby in it. It even at one point mentioned a specific player who was maybe been one of the reasons we lost yesterday or Saturday. which is a big moment of mourning in Wales. Anyway. Yes.
It rather carries on from what Julian said. You use dialogue very effectively in stories, but do you feel, now that you're living in this country or in Wales, part of the time, that do you still feel tuned in to the sound of American voices, or do you feel that it's not really an issue? Do Americans still sound the way you remember?
I think so. I mean, I have to be a little bit careful of not inserting something like, there aren't that many British words I've completely adopted, but lou's one of them, mobile's one of them. I still call what you stick luggage in your car a trunk. I don't really call it a boot. So there's a lot of Americanism that's sort of kept. I suppose that's one of the aspects of being a little worried about writing in contemporary America. 20 years ago, I know what people sounded like, but now I hope I'm right.
I'm interested to see that some of your stories are sort of inspired by your reactions to works of art. So I'm just wondering how that sort of comes about, really, whether it's like, it's when you see the work of art straight away, or it comes about over time and sort of reflecting on it, or that sort of thing. Or...
It actually came out of a project that I do with my partner guy, Paul Edwards, who's a painter. And some of you may know Callum Kerr. I started this project when I was still at the University of Winchester, and at the time so was Callum Kerr, and he started National Flash Fiction Day. He's now the writer-in-residence at the Winchester School of Art. But anyways, his first ever National Flash Fiction Day, all his events were around here. And I thought, oh, maybe I should do something in Cardiff. And of course I was thinking at the same time, Carol, no, write. Like, why are you going to spend time doing another project? You should be spending that time writing. But then Paul and I thought of the idea of somehow joining painting and images and words in this project. It's something we're always interested in. So we started it. And so he gathered, the first time, 8 painters, and I gathered 8 writers, including myself. And then the artists, rather, not just painters, sent images to the writers. They all sort of chose, they had them send me their list of top 3 they'd want to write about. Then they had a month to write a piece of flash fiction. And then we had an event on Flash Fiction Day in which the images were projected and the writers read their work. And we've now done that 5 times, I think, and I've taken part 3 times, which is where those stories came from. I sort of love how the stories wouldn't exist if I hadn't done this project. And there's also another 20 stories that wouldn't exist if we hadn't done that project. So it was really, it was really fun and very gratifying. Yes?
Do you find, like, when you start to write a collection of stories that you have a theme in mind, or is it just that, like, a theme emerges now? Or is there a theme at all in your work?
Yeah, I think for me, it just emerges. As I said, The Missing Woman was one of the later stories that I read, and yet it seemed like the perfect title, that it fit all the stories really well. So I think the theme for me is subconscious rather than conscious. And I've never sat down to write a story, oh, I need another story for The Missing Woman. It just doesn't work that way for me. Yes?
Yeah, you might remember me from your module last year.
I most certainly do.
Yeah, no, I was actually wondering, like, in your current set of short stories, were there any, like, on a similar note to your module of Writer Steel, were there any writers you feel that you stole from in that, or, like,
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. I wanted to ask her that.
I don't think there's any that were really specifically modeled on a particular short story by somebody else. Although I do think my, maybe a style or maybe an attention to detail is something that I value in other writers, so that's something that I'm looking at. And the new novel I'm writing, hopefully, it's a novel, I am actually quite studiously thinking about The Great Gatsby when I write it. In part, I want it to be shorter. In part, it's the narrator is somebody who's a step away from the action. And so that's something that and also it's so beautifully plotted. So that's something I'm a little bit more consciously looking at than I have, I think, with any of the stories.
But how did you sort of come to the short story? I mean, is that through reading particular writers, or is there, I mean, are there particular writers or many writers, or how does it?
I mean, I think the short story is just so much easier to deal with in workshop that I think graduate school creative writing programs maybe are increasing the number of short stories being written and being read, because it's really hard to critique a novel in workshop. You know, you can critique the first chapter, and then if you're lucky enough to be with somebody in the next workshop, maybe the second chapter, maybe the third. But to critique an entire novel in workshop is really difficult. So, and I suppose a writer does probably mistakenly think of the short story as where you start, just because it's a little bit, it's much shorter. It's not really any easier, but you can see all of it in one go in a way that is very difficult to see a novel in one go. I mean, I've often put up the first page of each chapter, of each section of a novel on the wall, like tape them up all around me. It's just to try to get like a sense of it all at once. So a short story is easier to sort of get the whole of it, to see the whole of it all at once.
I mean, I tend to think that there's many more outlets for short stories in America, from the New Yorker on down. There's a tradition of publishing short stories in literary magazines. There's a lot of university magazines like Raritan, or I want to try Kenyon Review or something, that have traditionally published short stories, and I'm not sure there's anything quite comparable in this country to that.
Yeah, the Warwick Review does that. There's Ambit.
Okay.
There's a few here, but you're absolutely correct. There's not nearly as many, even proportionately, as there are in the States. And it is a really great venue for new writers. And I'm looking at all my students in the audience, BA and MA. I mean, and even a really small, I was the fiction editor of a really small journal for a while called Two Rivers Review, and I used to get dozens and dozens of submissions for just one slot. So it's competitive, but the outlets are there, and it is it's really wonderful when something's accepted too.
Yeah, no, I'm sure.
I'm really interested in the process of how people write. You referred to a bit, I think you said that you don't necessarily do it chronologically, is that what you said? And you talked about putting the sort of, I was just wondering, because I'm quite, I work with children and we talk about how different writers write, and do you tend to set aside time? How long, sorry, these are practical things, but how long would it take from, having the idea to producing the final?
Yeah, it really depends. But The Missing Woman I wrote pretty quickly, for me, in about a month. I had a really good draft, and that's really quick for me. And it was, I'll mention it was inspired by, unfortunately, by a colleague when I was working in Washington who did disappear. So I was in the search party that this couple runs into. And I had no plans to write about this. I don't think I could have written about it directly because it was horrible. But I ended up writing about it somewhat indirectly. But I think that's why that story came about so quickly as well. It was really something I really had to deal with, grapple with in some way. And the God who was himself who whispered, the God who was himself whispered in her ear came pretty quickly as well. But other stories like The City for a Brotherly Something, that was in gestation for ages, for years. Like I'd have a draft and I think I needed to, I just wasn't happy with it. And it really wasn't until I wasn't even going to include it in the collection. And I sent it to my editor and thought, you like this? And she did. So then I worked on it a bit more and tried to intensify it a bit. So it just varies from story to story.
Question over there.
In terms of, so you were saying, as Christian asked, you were talking about writing inspired by art, and with The Missing Woman it's writing inspired by an event in your actual life. How often is that, so that inspiration coming from almost vaguely something from your actual life? Do you find you often sort of autobiographically write in a disconnected way? Or are you more often writing completely fiction?
Well, it's all fiction, but some of the stuff, like the Missing Woman, was more well, it was inspired by something autobiographical, but the main story of that isn't. And then things like there's a story, Honor's Daughter, which is in part about a father trying to deal with an anorexic daughter and try to sort of talk her through wanting to live. And that was a bit inspired by a school superintendent I knew. He just mentioned one or two things about his daughter and mentioned that she was anorexic. And so, I mean, but I knew very little and just sort of was interested in that whole idea. And then all sorts of stuff for that story I made up as well. So I suppose it's not surprising that some tiny little anecdote I'll hear will sort of just get me thinking and writing. Often, when I don't know what I'm writing yet, I'll often go out with my notebooks somewhere so I'm not distracted by email and everything. And you know, when I don't know what I'm writing, I'll just write. And so I might write a paragraph about something that somebody told me, and then I write something else that I remember, and then it just spawns other ideas and other descriptions, and at some point I think, oh wait, this might be a story. I think you always have to write what you don't know as well, even if you start with what you do know. In my Off the Page book, there's this marvelous quote from the really great writer Stuart Dybek, who says, I write what I know so I can write what I don't know. So you sort of maybe start in some place and then like push yourself into another place. You couldn't only, I don't think, write what you know. At least I don't think I could. I'd get bored.
I'm glad you mentioned Off the Page. Just tell everybody a little about that project and how that came about.
Yeah, well, part of my journalistic career before I moved here was I was working for WashingtonPost.com as an online news producer. And on a slow news day on a Saturday, the woman who ran the online discussion section, which were interviews with people that were online, and members of the audience could send a question in, and the producer would sort of field those questions and send them to the guest, and the guest would answer them, and they'd go out together live. Anyway, we were just chit-chatting, and she said I said, oh, I noticed you had this author on the other day. She goes, oh yeah, we never really get authors on that much anymore. We don't really have time. And I said, really? Would you want author interviews, more of those? And she said, yeah, that'd be fun. I was like, well, I could do something. So it sort of started that way. And at first, when I was still employed with them, I did this once a week. And then for a year, I did it every other week. And it ended up, I had 43 interviews. And at some point at a writer conference, somebody said, that would make a great book. And I thought, oh my God, she's right. And then I began to pursue that.
Sounds wonderful. So you were sort of able to think, well, who would I like to talk to this week
it was
about fiction?
So great. It was also, yeah, I mean, and you would base it on whether somebody had a book coming out. That's when authors are the most accessible. And so I still remember the moment when I called Martin Amos's publicist in America, because he was coming out with Yellow Dog at the time. And I said, would he be interested? And all of a sudden, he was. And I said, well, you know, sometimes often people would be on the phone, so they wouldn't have to come into the office, and I would type like a frantic maniac their answers as they dictated them to me on the phone. Send them out live. It'd be live for like 1 hour. But anyways, I said, well, he can either go by the phone or we can do it by email if he wishes, etc. And they said, oh, he's terrible with technology. I'll just have him come into the office when he's in town. I'm like, oh, okay, that'll be all right. Sure, I can manage that. And I was secretly quite excited. And he was unbelievably gracious, I have to say. But I've seen him since, and he wasn't maybe quite so gracious. He likes to provoke, doesn't he? But he went up in the elevator. People were, coming up to him and asking to sign the book, and he was just incredibly gracious. And I have to say, when he answered questions, incredibly intelligent. He quoted 2 Philip Larkin poems from heart.
Wow, okay,
Yeah.
that's impressive. Now, we're coming towards the end of our time today. Are there any more questions you'd like to send in to the outset?
Just curious to know that any of your short story ideas, as you start to work on them, whether you feel, actually I want this to be a novel, I want it to be something longer than a short story.
So far, it's been clear to me whether something's a novel or a story, which is good, because I know one writer who said his first novel, 899 pages later, ended up being a short story of 15 pages. And he hated that, even though he loved the story and it was his first thing published, he didn't include it in his collective, Richard Bausch, because he just hated the entire process of that. So luckily that hasn't happened to me yet, and I hope it doesn't, actually. I suppose, actually, the novel I'm working on now, I just, again, wrote some ideas down, and I didn't know what it would end up being, and it's really changed a lot since that first initial scribble. But I suppose that idea could have turned into a short story, but it didn't.
Obviously, you've written short stories and novels as well as writing journalistically. Are there any forms that you haven't written yet that you would like to, maybe in the future? I don't know.
I've even written the odd poem. Not that I'm ever going to admit that to the poets in the audience. Such as? I don't know. I don't think so. I mean, genres left would be a play. I even did, in graduate school, I made a point of, I took a playwriting class, in part because I'd had this instructor as an undergraduate, and he was so marvelous, I just wanted to take a class with him again. So those are just little scenes. That would be cool, but I don't see myself trying, so maybe I don't want to that much.
Well, one sort of last move, as it were. I love the way in, I've got the title, The One I Will, you suddenly turn to the reader, who at least in my case, suddenly jumps back when you say, but you want me to come to my point, don't you? To the culmination of my story, and I plead guilty. I want to know what's going to happen. So you have, I think, a strong sense of your readers. What would you like to tell your readers before we finish?
That story is so completely different from all the others that I was almost worried about including it, because it has such a different tone and voice, and yet I remember having such fun writing that. I remember just having a blast, like just sort of trying to flip things around again and again and again, really quite consciously doing that. So I think I'm trying to avoid this question. I'm not sure what I want to tell my readers, except,
Yes, or more generally, is there anything you'd like to tell the audience tonight? By way of conclusion.
Gosh, I don't know. There's so many of my lovely students here. And I guess I'd want to say, don't hesitate, don't hold back, just go for everything. Just write a lot and don't worry about whether it's good enough. Just do it and have fun.
Okay, thank you very much.